Well, good evening. Welcome back. Thank you for taking the time to come back during a busy work week. Tonight we're going to be continuing our series on how to grow as Christians. And as Glenn talked about, we set up the scene for that with the parable of the vine, seeing how we've got to be connected to Jesus in order to grow at all. That's the key to all of this. And then yesterday evening, we talked about growing in prayer. And that one was very much the kind of thing you can do individually. We do pray collectively. A lot of prayers are collective. But really, everything in that lesson could be practiced at home by yourself. Today's lesson is very much the opposite. When it comes to growing, you can do a lot of growing by yourself. But there are certain areas of the Christian life where you just can't grow in by yourself. Certain areas where the only way that growth happens is together. And certain areas where it's crucial that we are together and that we are growing not only closer to Christ, but closer to each other. And so that's why tonight's lesson is called Growing in Unity. As we grow towards God, are we also growing as a church closer to each other? Now, with each of these lessons, I've really tried to make it very practical, where we can look at, here are some specific things that I can work on to accomplish this task. And I want to do that tonight with unity as well. However, it's a strange topic for trying to get practical, like here are the specific things. What I want to do tonight is, rather than just staying with the easy parts of this topic, I want to really try to dig into some of the really difficult parts of this challenging topic of unity. With unity, it's the kind of thing where it's when you're in a nice, loving church and spending time together, unity feels easy, where it feels easy to have a relationship with those around you. When you go to a potluck and everybody's talking and everything and you're spending time together and it feels like, yes, of course we're unified. It just feels like unity goes without saying in those kinds of instances. However, I think we all know that there are times and relationships where unity does not go without saying, where unity becomes challenging, where maybe there's a conflict, where one person wants to do one thing and somebody else wants to do another thing, and then you have challenges, or one person steps on someone else's toe and then you've got an issue and somebody gets a little ruffled, and now how do I have unity? Now how do we handle it? And what I've found is those are the situations where we really grow in our unity. If I can hit that kind of a situation where there's a conflict, where I want to do this and she wants to do this and he wants to do this thing over there, and we're all not sure how to work this out, and then we get together and we do work it out, that's when the church really grows. And so that's what I really want to focus on tonight. And I think that those are the kinds of things that we need to talk about during times of peace. When everything's good, we need to be equipping ourselves for how do we grow to the point that we can handle those challenges when they come up, when there are those challenges. Because they always come up, regardless of who we are, regardless of what the relationship is. Whether it's in a church, whether it's in a family, whatever relationship it is, there are always bumps because we're human. And as good as we are, there's challenges. There's my personality versus your personality. And sometimes those personalities just don't work so well together. And so, tonight, we're going to deal with some of the more difficult issues of how do I grow when there's conflict? How do I resolve that conflict? How do I go from conflict to wonderful unity? All right, the text we're going to be using is Philippians 4, verses 1 through 3, and I will have it on the screen. If you want to, you can turn to it because that might be handy. There will be some sections of Philippians that you'll probably want to refer to while we're going through this. But let me go ahead and put it up on the screen. It's a very short section, and it's the kind of section where you look at it and you feel like there's not enough material there to really preach a sermon on. But I think what you'll find out is there's a lot here. If you really start digging into this and start connecting it to the rest of the book of Philippians, this is an extremely instructive section on how to resolve conflict in a church, among Christians, but even in other relationships as well. Although we're going to see most of these points are going to really only pertain to Christians with Christians. All right, so let's read this. Philippians 4, starting in verse 1. Therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved. I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Okay, so the situation sounds like there's some little conflict in this church in Philippi. Now, what's interesting is that these people that are mentioned, we don't read about them anywhere else. So we don't know the backstory to this. We really don't know anything more than just what we have in those little verses there. But we know enough from these verses that it piques our curiosity and we can kind of put the picture together a little bit. So there are these two people, Euodia and Syntyche, two women there in the church in Philippi. And Paul says he's entreating them to get along, as he talks about it, he says he's entreating them to agree in the Lord. Apparently they're disagreeing. So he's saying, could you please just work out this disagreement? And then he asks whoever true companion is. We don't know who the true companion is, but he asks the true companion to help them. And then he brings up a few other people that we'll get into as well. So that's the situation. We don't know what the disagreement was over. We don't know how big of a disagreement it was. I mean, they're still in the church there, it sounds like. It doesn't sound like they've gone on to some other city or something. I mean, it sounds like they're right there and there's some issues. And Paul's like, you need to work it out. All right, well, right off the bat, there's a couple of observations we can make off this text, even before we dive deeper into it. Some just surface level things we could note that are very important. One is conflicts need to be resolved. I mean, you look at this text, and here's what Paul says. He says, I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. He's entreating them. Please, ladies, let's work this out. Let's solve whatever this is that's happening here. Now, here's the way I think of this, to visualize this. So there you've got the church in Philippi. There's all the people there. And you've got these two women, Euodia and Syntyche, that have this little disagreement there. So everything else, as far as we know, everything else is pretty good. He doesn't point out, and tell them and them and them and them and them to work out their problems. It's not like Corinth where it sounded like there were all sorts of disagreements. No, of the whole church in Philippi, he only points out two individuals that need to specifically work on a disagreement. But as Paul stands back and looks at this, here's Paul, and Paul says, fix it. As he's looking at this whole church, he's like, hey, right there, fix that one. Now, I think there's a big lesson in that. You could kind of zoom out and say, well, overall, I mean, we've got a 90% or whatever, however big the church was. We'd say the church is 95% at peace right now. That really, if there's just two women who can't get along, that seems like a pretty small issue. Why bring it up at all? Paul says, no. Right there, fix that one. So what that tells me is conflicts need to be fixed. Now that has a lot of application because sometimes conflicts aren't fixed. Sometimes conflicts just fester. And we get used to them after a while. That, there's those two people who can't get along and it's always been that way. I mean, for years they've never gotten along, but it's okay. I mean, they sit over here and I sit over here and we're fine. And it can go on and on that way, and we just kind of, you just get used to it sometimes. And you can kind of think of that in your own life. That, I mean, thinking of application, are there people who I get along with everybody? There's that one person I'd rather not have to talk to that person. And there may be people in your life that are like that, where you feel like, yeah, but that's just one person. That's just that one person over there that we don't really get along. I get along really well with everybody else, so I feel like I'm actually pretty good at unity. And Paul would say, no. Paul would say, no, fix that one, that right there, fix that one. So that tells me that even when there's one little conflict, where what Christ wants me to focus on is that one little conflict. Resolve that one. Okay, so that's the first observation. The other observation that's real surface level on this, but really important, is that conflicts can happen even among very strong Christians. And here's why I say that with this text. Look at the way he describes Euodia and Syntyche. He says there, he says in that lower part, he says, yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel. So he's saying these two women have previously labored side by side with Paul. So who were these women? I don't know, but they were women who'd actually worked with Paul. And now, how did they labor side by side with him? I don't know. I mean, were they on some of his preaching trips? I don't know. Were they teaching like some ladies' Bible studies there? I don't know. How were they laboring side by side? Maybe when he was in Philippi, they were helping him in some way. Maybe it was that they were teaching some ladies there, or maybe it was that they were financially helping him, or I don't know. Somehow they were laboring right side by side with Paul, which tells me they're not new converts. These are women who've been doing a lot of good in the church in times past. We could think that, at some point I get to such a level of maturity that unity is not a problem anymore. I could get along with anybody. But I think we all know that's not the case, that, there can still be conflicts. There can be a time where I've been a Christian for a really long time, and yet, from the New King James because it's helpful here. There in verse 2, he says, I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. So notice that phrase, be of the same mind. Then go to the next verse there. He says, yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel. Now, so just thinking about those three phrases, we've got being of the same mind, we've got being side by side, and all this is happening in the gospel. Now, if you flip back to chapter 1, and do this, open your Bible there if you're not. I'm going to put it on the screen, but I'd like you to have it in your Bible because I think it'll be easier to see the connection if we look at it on the screen and see where it lays out in the book of Philippians. So, here it is in the screen, and then I also want to read a little bit more in the Bible, but here it is on the screen. Philippians 1, verse 27. So this is, if you see in your Bible, this is towards the end of chapter 1. And look at the phrasing that we've got going on here. He says, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. Now, do you notice some similar wording there? We've got same mind there. He's using the same phrase there, being of the same mind. Now here in Philippians 1:27, he's talking to the whole church, telling the whole church they need to be of the same mind. Then he also says, after being of one mind there, he says, striving side by side. So he also uses that phrase, talking to the whole church. And then he says, for the faith of the gospel. So there's definitely some similar things. He's basically, back in chapter 1, he's given this thought to the whole church of we all need to have one mind, we all need to be working side by side, we all need to be working for the faith of the gospel. Then when you get over to chapter 4, he says to these women, now women who are, you two ladies that are having this conflict, you all need to be of the same mind, side by side for the gospel. Now, connecting that just a little further, as you continue to read down through chapter 1, he continues to talk about how the church needs to be striving side by side, and he goes through and talks about that a little bit more. But then he gets down into chapter 2, and I put this one on the screen, and then we'll finally read it from the Bibles as well. So in chapter 2, dropping down to verse 2, he says, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. So look, he's got the same phrase again. In chapter 2, we're in the same context. If you just take out that chapter break, you'll see that it flows really nicely. At the end of chapter 1, he's talking about how we need to be thinking all the same, working side by side, working towards the gospel. And then as you continue into chapter 2, he's continuing to say how if you could make me really, really happy right now, if you're just all of the same mind, if you're having the same love for each other, you're being in one accord with one mind, not being selfish, all those kinds of things. And then, look with me. I don't have it on the screen, but let's keep reading that. So we just read verse 3. Look at how the context continues. Let's read verse 4. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And he continues. So here's what Paul has done. The end of chapter 1 and on into chapter 2 is this section about unity. And as he's talking about unity, he's saying how we need to be of the same mind, and we're thinking, well, okay, Paul, how do I do that? How, Paul? Give me an example. Show me what that looks like. And he says, all right, be like Christ. And then he describes Christ. He says, have that same mind that was in Christ. And he does it like this, where he says, Christ emptied himself, he became a servant, he humbled himself, he was obedient all the way to the point of death, even death on a cross. Lowered himself, lowered himself, lowered himself, lowered himself. He says that's how you become one mind. Now this, of course, is what we talked about Sunday morning with our sermon about taking the lower seat. And we ended that by actually reading this text and talking about how that's what Jesus did. He lowered himself, he lowered himself, he lowered himself, he lowered himself. He started out in the form of God, then he became a man, then he humbled himself to the point of death, even death on a cross, all the way down and down and down. And here Paul's saying that's the key to unity. That's how we have unity. That's how we are of one mind, by having that mindset of Christ, by taking that little chair. Okay, so connecting that all together, what I tried to show here is that Paul's already explained earlier on in the book of Philippians that the key to unity is having this mindset of Christ. That if you want to be unified, you lower yourself, lower yourself, lower yourself, lower yourself. And then when he gets to talking to Euodia and Syntyche, he doesn't have to review that whole thing. He just gives us those same key words, saying, don't you remember? One mind, like we said, one mind, striving side by side for the gospel. Don't you remember? And we've already read it, so we already know, oh yeah, we remember how to do that, Paul. That was where we were supposed to be like Christ and lower ourselves. So the key for Euodia and Syntyche, when they're scratching their heads thinking, well, Paul, how do I do this? How do I become of one mind? Right there. That's how Euodia and Syntyche work out their differences. The key that we're seeing here, of this mindset of Christ, is that unity happens right down here at the bottom. If I'm way up there at the top, it's pretty hard to be unified. But the more I can lower myself and lower myself and lower myself, that's when I can meet you. When we try to meet each other up here, it's all conflict. But if we meet each other way down here at the bottom, that's when we can start resolving the differences and getting along. It's got to start with taking that lower chair like we talked about so much on Sunday. That's where unity is found. And so, when those conflicts arise, and I'm realizing I'm not getting along well with this person, the first thing I need to do is ask myself, where am I? Am I way up at the top, or am I way down at the bottom? Am I in the big chair, or am I in the little chair? Where's my attitude right now? Am I, all those things we talked about on Sunday, am I recognizing that I don't know everything? Am I recognizing that I make mistakes? Am I having that kind of humility? Because if I'm not, then there's the problem right there. That's what needs to be fixed to bring that conflict, to resolve that conflict. A lot of times conflicts will be between, I think this is what the Bible teaches, and they're saying, well, no, I think this is what the Bible teaches. And we can argue that and argue that and argue that. But until we can both take the lower seat well enough to say, I don't know everything. Until we can do that, to have enough humility to realize that I'm not all knowledgeable, we're probably never going to be able to work it out. And that goes for so many other conflicts. Until I can humble myself down to the very bottom here, I'm not going to be able to resolve that conflict. Humbling myself to the bottom to be able to say I'm sorry that I was the one who stepped on your toe. Humbling myself to the bottom to say that, I shouldn't have been the one who charged in here and told you that. I should have taken it. I should have maybe been a lot more gentle with the way I approached this, or whatever it may be. Until I can lower myself, I'm never going to be able to resolve the conflict. All right, so that's the first thing. The next one, going back again to our chapter 4 with Euodia and Syntyche. Accepting help from others. This one is another big lesson we can get just from these couple of verses here. Look at what Paul tells them to do. He says there, in the second half of it, he says, yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel. So he's telling them, he's saying, he tells this true companion to be there helping these two women. So not first he tells the women that they need to resolve the conflict. Then he tells his true companion, you need to go help them. So here's the way I visualize that. Here, as we said, there's the two women that can't work it out. Euodia and Syntyche are trying to work through this, and he says, fix it. But then he doesn't stop there. Then he picks out this one other person in the congregation who he calls true companion, and he says, hey, you tell them, you help them fix it. That's Paul's key to resolving this conflict. And that's a really important key to resolving the conflict there. So thinking through what that means, I don't know who true companion was. It could be that, maybe it's just a nickname that Paul gave him, or it could be that everybody knows, oh yeah, Paul's true companion. Yeah, we know who you're talking about. I'm not sure who it was, but it was somebody there who was in a good position to be able to help these two women resolve it. Now, really probably everyone in the church should help them, but for some reason this individual was better equipped than everybody else to help them resolve that conflict. Now, here's what I think there's two things we can take from that, two really big lessons. One is, when I'm going through some kind of conflict with somebody, I need to find a true companion who can help me with it. A lot of times, I want to take it all on myself, and I feel like, no, I can fix it. I can fix this problem. I'm really good at fixing things. And I might find out that it doesn't, I can't. This one's too big for me. This is too hard. Sometimes this happens in a marriage where there's a marriage conflict, and the two marriage partners are fighting, and maybe it goes on for years, and nobody else knows that there's a problem. And they keep feeling like, well, we don't want anyone else to know that we can't get along. We try to put on a face when we're around other people, but it just keeps going on and on. We'll get through this. We'll fix it. And it goes on and on and on until the whole thing blows up. And nobody knew. And if we could instead just find a true companion who could help us. Some of the advantages of the true companion is that they see things that we don't see, that I may be too close to that conflict to be able to see really what's going on. I'm right in the midst of it. All I can see is my perspective on it. If some third party could come in, they could look at it and be like, oh, here's the issue. Here's the real issue. Why don't we just do this? And they could help us work through it. So that's one big lesson is when we're having the conflict, find someone who can be a true companion. And they need to be someone who is a true companion, who's loving and caring and who wants to help us. But go out of our way to find that person. The second lesson I could learn from this is be a true companion. When you see people who are in that conflict, be that person who's loving enough and kind enough to be able to step in and help. Now that's really hard to do because a lot of times that's not going to be interpreted as a loving thing to do. We've got to make sure we are a true companion. They don't feel like, well, now we're just meddling in the whole big problem. And where it's not us turning into some big gossip thing where now it's exploded and everything. No, someone who can go in and lovingly encourage and help and actually help them resolve the issue. All right, so I think that's a big one, is when there's a conflict between two individuals, true companion needs to come in and help as well. All right, the next one, remember the goal. Sometimes we lose sight of the goal. As we're fighting over this, we lose sight of what it is we're trying to accomplish. When you're at odds with somebody else, what are you trying to accomplish? Well, I want them to see it my way. That's what I'm trying to accomplish. Is that what Paul is getting at here? Is he telling Euodia to help Syntyche to see it her way? Is he telling Syntyche to help Euodia see it her way? Here's what he says. He tells them, he says, I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree. So you might say, well, yeah. What he wants them to do is just come to some kind of agreement that they can both be on the same page on. Whatever it might be, if they can at least just both agree on it, then we can finally have some peace. But then, here's the key. You notice that agree is not the end of the sentence. Then he says, agree in the Lord. That's the goal. The agreement has to be in the Lord. So often, we come to some resolution that's an agreement, but maybe it's not an agreement in the Lord. And here's the difference. So trying to visualize this. An agreement is when two parties are on the same page on whatever the issue is. An agreement in the Lord would be where I agree with you, you agree with me, and we both agree with the Lord. That you've got the relationship going both directions. That we're in agreement with each other, and that agreement is also something that Jesus agrees with as well. Now, I mean, this is really obvious, but of course gets messed up so many times. So let me give this really simple example that we can all agree with, and it's so simple it's silly, but I'm using it because I think we need to understand what this actually looks like. So here's an example. So let's say we had a guy in a congregation who's saying, I just really would want to get a divorce. There's this other woman that I'd really like to marry, so I'm going to get this divorce and go marry her. And so then the rest of the congregation is saying, no, you can't do that. It's not right. You can't do that. And so then there's this conflict. And this kind of thing does happen. And the reason I give this example is because it's simple enough that we could all look at it and be like, no, that's bad. So let's say this disagreement goes on and on and on and on and on until finally it gets more heated and more heated. It goes back and forth, and he's saying, no, I'm going to get a divorce, and they're saying, no, you shouldn't, and no, you can't, and on and on and on, until finally they say, all right, fine, we'll just go get your divorce. At this point, of course, there's agreement. They resolved the problem. And, of course, this can happen. You can have churches where now we've got an agreement. And then, of course, you have what Jesus says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for the cause of sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And so here you have, it's an agreement, but, of course, it's not in the Lord. And so I give that example only because that one's super clear and obvious. The problem is that can happen with so many other things, where we can have an agreement and we find, well, finally we resolved it. And yet, of course, it's not in the Lord. The key to resolving the difference is for us both to determine what does Jesus want on this issue. And doing that, of course, takes all the humility and everything of us lowering ourselves and all of that, and it not being about my pride and what I want and everything, and trying to find what Jesus wants. But that's got to be the goal of how does Jesus want us to resolve this? That needs to be the end destination, not prove to them that my way is always right and their way is wrong, or that, this is how my family always did it, therefore what they're saying is wrong. None of that. Instead, it's got to be, what does Jesus want? And with the open mind that what Jesus wants very well could be totally different than what my side of the argument is. Okay. The next one is remembering the relationship. This is super important because a lot of times we put so much focus on that last point with agreeing in the Lord, that we focus so much on beating each other up with the Bible that we forget who we're actually talking to and the relationship we have with that other person. And that's a really important one from this text as well. If you look at the way Paul describes this, look at all the words that he uses here. He starts it out with, therefore, my brothers. So that's a term of affection, family term, whom I love and I long for, my joy and my crown. Stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved. Look at all the loving terms he's used so far. He says, I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I ask you also, true companion, which is another affectionate term, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers, which again feels like a term of affection whose names are in the book of life. So here he gives all these terms of affection of our relationship with each other. We're fellow workers. We're true companions. We're side by side. We love each other. There's this joy and all of these things. When we're in the midst of that conflict, it's really easy to forget all of those points, to start feeling like, well, that's the person who's wrong, and that becomes their identity. If that's the person who is wrong on this issue, instead of thinking, that's my brother, that's my sister, that's the person who I've worked side by side with for so long. That's where Paul focuses on. You know, he barely mentions, he doesn't even tell us what the disagreement is. What he does tell us is we've worked together side by side, we've worked together, we love each other over and over. That's where he puts the emphasis. And if we can put our mental emphasis on that, that goes a really long ways towards resolving the conflicts. And then the other neat thing is, at the end of it, he says, whose names are in the book of life. He not only emphasizes their relationships with each other, but at the end, he mentions their relationship with God, which that takes it to a whole nother level. All right, well, and then the last one. Here's taking it to the last one. Remembering the mission. As he mentions all these things that we need to keep in mind, the other aspect of this that's really key is where they're headed towards. And look at how he says this. Towards the end, he says, yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. So he brings up at the end here what they've done previously. Previously, Euodia and Syntyche have labored in the gospel. Why bring up the gospel? Why bring up that they've worked in the gospel? Why not just say, you know, those two women, we've known each other a long time. Those two women need to get along. Why does he bring up that they've labored in the gospel? Here's what I think that phrase really does for us. We start out with these two people who are fighting. And then he takes it and says, but remember how it used to be. Remember before there was this fight, how it was me and Euodia and Syntyche, and we were all working to spread the gospel together. That was our mission, that was our goal, and we were all side by side working to spread the gospel. And then Paul doesn't stop there. Then he says, oh yeah, and remember Clement. Hey, how Clement, who's also working to spread the gospel. And then he says, oh yeah, and then all my fellow workers who are working towards that as well. So he started out with this conflict, and then he just turns things around. Instead of having the arrows going towards each other, he turns things around and says, all right, but look at what we should be doing and what all these other people are doing. And he pushes us all up towards that big goal of spreading the gospel. It's like Paul's saying, if we quit looking inward and fighting inward and started looking outward and working outward, that would resolve all of the conflict. If we could go back to being the fellow workers, that would resolve the conflict. I think there's a huge lesson there. The more we can focus on the mission, the less we'll focus on the fight. The more we can fight Satan, the less we fight each other. It's really simple in that kind of way. But of course, in times of peace, it's easy to remember that. But when conflicts come, that's when it's hard, and you have to purposely put yourself back and say, now, remember the mission. This conflict is not what's important. What's important is our conflict with Satan. What's important is that lost soul out there who's dying while I try to fight with this person who has a personality conflict with me. What's really important is all of those people out there who desperately need the gospel. All right, well, here's what we found. When those conflicts arise, and they always do, even when things seem so perfect and wonderful, at some point, we all have disagreements with people. And so the key is having that humble mind of Christ, accepting help from other people, seeing that I can't do this alone. I need your input. I need your help to get me through this. Remembering what our goal is. It's not about getting them to agree with me. The goal is to find what Christ wants. remembering that relationship, remembering that we're brothers and sisters and acting like it and treating each other like that. And then, of course, remembering the mission. If we can focus more on spreading the gospel, that brings peace to everything, because then our mission is all about bringing that peace to the world. All right, well, if you're not a Christian, then we want to invite you this evening to come forward and to give your life to Christ and to begin living that life that's not about yourself, but instead is about Him. A life that is both focused on growing towards Christ, but also focused on growing towards each other, growing in unity, no matter what the challenges may be, always working towards that unity that can only be found in that relationship with Christ. If you're not a Christian, then we want to invite you to come forward and be baptized tonight while together we stand and sing.